As you can see, my dog sleeps on her America blanket, so I thought it might be a decent backdrop for this. So I kind of liked the idea of what I did before because I tend to ramble and sometimes get off track. Of course, you've noticed if you've listened to anything else that I posted. There was once before where I read a paper that I had written and just kind of read the paper, talked about it a little bit, and posted that as the video. So I think I'm going to do the same thing. So this paper is a final for a sociology course, which is, as absurd as you would expect in terms of curriculum. Of course, there's half of the discussion topics and assignments are on racism in the school system and the mistreatment of women and the gender pay gap and all that nonsense. So I've been stridently going my hardest against all this nonsense in hopes that some 18-year-old kid who's in the class also sees it and says, okay, I'm not the only one. I'm not insane. This really is stupid. And here's this guy willing to confront the class on it, even if it's only virtually. That's all I can do. So I'm doing my best. So this is like I said, the final to a sociology course. And the topic was basically wide open. You pick a social topic or a topic with social implications, and I think the word count was like something like 1,000, 1,200 or something like that. I, as always, ended up writing like 9 pages, but I'm just going to go ahead and read it. I feel like there's some things in here that are valuable and some things that I don't think I've heard other people talk about in this way. I think there are people on either side of the problem, but I don't know that there are too many people who are in between. I think Jordan Peterson is probably the closest to a person I would view as in between on this issue. It'll make more sense once I get into it, but I'm going to go ahead and just read it. So starting off, the topic I've selected is the comprehensive discarding of all semi-modern values, as it's typically believed these values came from, often one of the big three, religion, and Christianity in particular. The reason for this dismissal of values is the increase in non-believers in Western countries, and in the United States in particular. The importance of this topic is many of these values in fact do not come from religion, but are rather a result of hundreds of thousands of years of our ancestors' evolution, and so to fight them is to be in direct conflict with our own psychology and thus our own well-being. Since the creation of the United States, the claim that this country was founded on quote-unquote Judeo-Christian values has been made. In a country wherein the vast majority of the citizenry agrees, this claim need not be challenged in any significant way. If the vast majority of the comprising population is Jewish or Christian, there is not a stark opposition to most of the values contained within the worldview. Enlightenment values have slowly swept across the pond to confront this quote-unquote Christian country and its archaic beliefs. At this point in world history, the connection to a belief in God is by its very nature an exclusively emotional one. How do we know this? The God of the gaps plays a major role here. Basically, any concept yet to be understood by science is co-opted by the church, and God is given the credit. As we discover more and more about the world, the gaps between the known and unknown grow smaller and smaller. This also means that the opportunities afforded to religious people to smuggle their God into these gaps grow fewer and fewer. If a religious person is honest about our collective understanding of the cosmos, he or she must resort to giving God credit for the Big Bang, as almost all events from that point have been properly credited to scientific discovery with no accompanying supernatural funny business. If a religious person is dishonest and or ignorant about our collective understanding, it looks something like Herschel Walker saying, if humans came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Think about it. Just last year, he did say that. Of course, I'm in favor of Herschel Walker, even though he went to University of Georgia. But it was just a very stupid quote. Back to the paper. To set the groundwork ahead properly, the God story is but one of many stories we've told ourselves along our evolutionary history to better make sense of the world around us. There is a book, in fact there are many, but we'll deal with just the most relevant one here, which archives these stories told from a mystical perspective. We call this book the Bible. There is tremendous wisdom and value in the Bible, to be sure. The most important of its stories, however, carries with it a message which is currently being tossed out of the tub alongside the rest of the bathwater. This story is that of Jesus and his decision to bear the sins of the world. The importance of this story exists outside religion, of course, as all things most certainly do. The proclamation is, however, quite profound. To live a meaningful and fulfilled life, one must assume total accountability for one's own actions, as well as for one's effect on the world around him. The core issue at the very heart of my central idea in this message, alongside many other valuable lessons most often taught in a religious context. In an analogy, if we find a very carefully built architectural masterpiece, but we realize that the foundation is faulty, we ought to extract as much value from the building as possible, rather than simply knocking it down for its faulty foundation. I call this phenomenon of demolishing the building while disregarding its marvelous potential value comprehensive contrarian atheism. To put it as succinctly as I can, comprehensive contrarian atheism is the process of recognizing the falsehood of a culture's religious claims, then collapsing every possible aspect of that culture on the basis of its perceived foundation's untruth. There are really two sides, which are fairly well defined in modern times. We have progressives and conservatives. Conservatives tend to be more religious, and so often more traditional. Many social and moral positions are often reliably adopted by conservatives. A few examples are: God in the Bible is the source of our morality, therefore we ought to behave by the prescriptions of the Bible. Life has inherent value. This one is sometimes traced back to God, but not always. Therefore we ought not allow babies to be killed at any stage. Men and women are clearly different, and so says all available biological and neurological evidence. Therefore transgenderism ought not be accepted. There are many more, but these are of great social consequence. The progressive effectively takes the opposing position on the vast majority of these issues. Often there is a rationalization to be made, but there is a contrarian effort at work here. The social revolutionary seeks to adopt the contrary position for resentment's sake, when no rational argument exists. Irrational arguments are then conjured. Examples here would be: everyone has a different perspective judged by personal subjectivity, therefore morals are relative. A baby must be dependent on his or her mother to exist, so outlawing abortion is infringement on the mother's right to decide what she wants to do with her own body. Given the limitless potential for subjective experience, a person need not adopt one of two rigid perspectives with relationship to his or her own biology. It is possible to have a certain set of genitalia but experience the world through an entirely unique lens, etc. Again, there are many more positions here, and the vast majority of them are in direct conflict with the conservative position, regardless of the soundness and validity of the argument. Simply put, the social roles of these two groups are that of defender and offender. The conservative seeks to protect the systems in place as they have led to unprecedented flourishing in the freest country on earth, while the progressive seeks to uproot all social institutions in favor of closing the quote-unquote wealth gap, racial equity, equality between the sexes, etc. It is analogous to a castle siege. The conservative wants to protect or conserve the castle in which he has thrived, while the progressive seeks to infiltrate the castle and reshape it to fit his or her ideal vision of what a world could be. The 20th century is quite reflective of this situation in which we now find ourselves. Here I'm speaking about the spread of Marxist communism in many countries across the world. The reason this is relevant is because we get to see exactly what the endgame looks like. To quote Dr. Pendleton, 6 American authors who had previously favored communism wrote the book The God That Failed. Each thought his idea of what was right would be imposed on society. Each was severely disillusioned. This aligns with the common trope we hear from modern supporters of such ideas. Well, that wasn't real communism or Marxism or socialism. Take your pick. In modern times, this looks something like an entire state media apparatus adopting a singular political ideology and demonizing all who oppose. Even back in 2005, the result of a study examining media stats, information, etc., coming from politically partisan organizations, say, quote, "Our results show a strong liberal bias. Of all the news outlets we examine, except Fox News' special report and the Washington Times, receive scores far to the left of the average member of Congress." That's a study from Gross Close and Milio, 2005. Do we imagine it's any better now? Remember, that was in 2005. This is also the case with almost all cultural institutions. Even in the case of my school, a political side has very clearly been taken, if only one is politically and historically astute to notice. For example, Starbucks, Disney, JetBlue, the vast majority of quote-unquote educational institutions, and thousands of other companies have included DEI training, which is explicitly a Marxist communist pillar, promoted drag queens while also endorsing quote-unquote drag shows for children, and the subtle but significant inclusion of other quote-unquote gender categories into the official institutional doctrine. And I say in parentheses, in creating my profile here at my school, I was asked if I'm male, female, or several other things. Workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives have been shown to delegitimize discrimination claims made by members of low-status groups, namely women and people of color. Here we see an article pressing the DEI issue regardless of its complete takeover. They say we aren't doing enough to instantiate this political ideology on citizens. It will never be enough. This shows the social inequality between the conservatives and progressives. There are even middle school boys being kicked out of school because they would not incorrectly call a fellow student a girl when he was in fact a boy. Given that the suicide rate among transgender people is wholly unaffected by fully transitioning, the conservative opposition to such topics is, again, incorrect in its grounding, but correct in its implementation. It's clearly far more psychologically healthy for people to accept who they are than to make drastic and lifelong changes to their bodies in an effort to conform their reality to their subjective experience. The two most prominent social conditions impacted by this issue are that of transgenderism and race relations. Simply put, religious people are right for the wrong reason, insofar as they actually follow their texts. Here speaking of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Their texts say that man and woman were created by God, woman from the rib of a man, in the case of the Old Testament and the Quran. It is for this reason that true followers of these faiths do not believe it possible for a man to become a woman. The social constructionist perspective that sexes are, well, a social construction, is directly opposed by these religious texts. Consequently, this idea is also directly opposed by everything we know about human biology. For example, men have different genitalia than women, different chromosomes, different average height and weight, bone density, and on and on and on. The evidence collected in the context of biology is just that, evidence. But the claims made in the holy books are a reflection of those human observations, written down and disseminated as proclamations from on high. It is for this reason that religious followers of this sort are again correct for the wrong reason. Their view of men and women align with basic human biology. The other social issue impacted tremendously by this rift is that of race, as I mentioned. So often we hear of this term, quote-unquote, lived experience. Now on a technical level, it's certainly true. People indeed have their own subjective experiences, each slightly unique. The problem is, however, given rise by people who are seeing ghosts, and claiming that because they feel they saw the ghost somehow exists in some objective sense. This is yet another example of religious people being right for the wrong reason. The holy texts, quote-unquote, tell us that we will be persecuted for our beliefs, among other things. It will happen. Our response to this, however, ought to be to bear that burden with our shoulders high and persevere through this grim habitat. These books call upon us to take full responsibility for our own lives, and to view the struggles we encounter as a net good. Overcoming such obstacles has the profound effect of making you a better and stronger person. Here, though, through the scientific lens, we see a rather obvious proclamation. You will encounter difficult times. To survive as a species, you must either persist or perish. Our ancestors have already completed the most difficult of times, but this actually plays to our disadvantage. And I put in parentheses here, we've all heard the trope, strong men create easy times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. We, yet again, see this social phenomenon strike right at the heart of our society. Many of the lessons we've learned through our history are contained in those books. The belief component is critical because otherwise people wouldn't be as ready to read them. These lessons have in some way been strengthened by this bizarre scenario in which we find ourselves. Don't touch the stove because it's too hot, doesn't quite hit as hard as. Don't touch the stove because if you do, God will send you to hell for eternity. It is for this reason that religious people are often right, but for the wrong reasons, as I've already stated. It is also for this very reason that modern atheists are far too quick to dismiss these books and their values because of the baggage and barbarism they carry. They are in fact, again, wrong for the right reason. Making careful and painstaking effort to extract the value we can out of these books as opposed to tossing them out is the path to better human flourishing, but due to comprehensive contrarian atheism, the baby is being actively tossed out with the bathwater. What exactly are we to do in the face of such a problem? Well, I look at it much like recycling. Quote, if everyone did it, we could solve the problem. Well, the problem is precisely that not everyone is doing it. Isn't that rather obvious? The reality is what we're doing now, especially when it comes to explicitly involving children in political escapades, hasn't yet shown its results. These cataclysmic results will not show for perhaps another decade. I would argue here that there is indeed not much to be done on the whole to solve this problem. If, however, I did have a magic prescription-making wand which would guarantee compliance, I would do two things. For my fellow conservatives, I would abandon this idea of God, just as we shed the metaphysical weight of Santa Claus when we were young. People in my group would certainly recoil at this thought. It would rank at the top of the list of the worst ideas ever devised. This is a major part of the problem. If we could accept the world as it is and look at our situation rationally and reasonably, we could realize that there is indeed tremendous value to be found in the Bible, and in fact, we do not need to accept the underlying claims about reality to extract that value. Just as is the case with Marcus Aurelius, we do not need any mystical or supernatural basis to apprehend the value of Stoicism. Such is also the case with the many values found in the Bible. For the other side, I would wave my wand and force everyone to realize that the true path to living a meaningful and purposeful life is to accept that personal accountability ought to be the framing through which we all view the world. Instead of complaining about who is making our lives harder, we ought to strive to overcome such challenges. I don't believe these claims often, but even in the case of someone proving there is indeed a conspiracy to keep them down, that would make the overcoming of adversity that much more meaningful. For example, there were many, many black men who fought on the side of the North during the Civil War. Now we cannot get into their minds, but just imagine, as a former slave, how much more meaningful that fight would be to you. Yes, our neighbors are fighting for their country. You, on the other hand, are fighting for your country and for the opportunity for your own children to have a life free of bondage. I could even lend a ton of slack here. Let's say I actually accept all of your claims of quote-unquote oppression. If your psychological framing declares that even though there are enemies all around, I will still overcome and live a meaningful and purpose-driven life on my own terms, then at the very end of the conversation I might have the M. Night Shyamalan moment where I whip out the Bible and show them that Jesus, given we accept for the sake of conversation that he was even real, said precisely the same thing. In effect, what I'm saying is the solutions are different for the different sides. For the right, we must give up our most precious toy, as Christopher Hitchens calls it. Only after having given it up, however, are we able to see that enjoyment can come from other sources. Meaning can come from other sources. In the meantime, that toy is still held tightly in their clutches. For the left, any individual can only look inward. This is the only way to make any progress in one's life. Think about a time in your life when things were hard, but despite all the obstacles you made it to the finish line. This is obviously the mindset we all ought to have in life, and we ought to carry forward with us. I fear, though, that many of this group have not actually experienced any adversity, and thus may not have such an experience from which they can draw. In that case, I don't know that anything can be done. Sorry to end on such a cynical note. So, I'm not sure what I'll get on that, given that the professor is a leftist. But yeah, I don't know. I think that there's something there, and like I said, Jordan Peterson does talk about it. You want to be careful not to toss everything out, but that's why I find those debates with Sam Harris so compelling with Jordan Peterson, even though Sam Harris is completely off the reservation at this point. He says, basically, you don't need the nonsense to get the value. And that's, I think, sort of the point that I was trying to argue there. There is some mediating in the middle, and the left is, I think it also helps their narrative of this like pure hedonism. If the Bible is no longer in the way for anyone, that gives, it creates the perfect path for that pure hedonism. So even in the case of other atheists who recognize this, if they're leftists, they don't care. They want it to be gone, because obviously they want to pursue only terrestrial pleasure in the name of themselves. And I view that as a sincere problem, especially as a father. I'm not really sure what to do there. There was that section at the end where you're supposed to provide your solutions, and to be honest, I don't think that there is a solution at this point. They've gone way too far away. At the same time, I don't know that we'll ever have any hope of getting everybody to abandon their belief in God, but also I don't know that we should want an overnight abandonment of those beliefs, because even though we can function normally without it, apparently a lot of people can't. That would just destroy their lives and cause mass rioting and looting beyond what we already see from the leftists. That's a problem that I suppose will only be addressed in time. But yeah, you don't need the magical wizardry stuff to extract the value from any religious book, just like you don't need it to extract the value out of Harry Potter. I wish people wouldn't think that you did, and I wish people wouldn't look at it directly from the other side and say, because the foundational claim is false, there can be nothing valuable in here. Both of those are the wrong answer, and here we are, stuck in the middle, watching both of these things happen in their own directions, and we're just kind of getting pulled along. So hopefully that was valuable, or at least entertaining for you. Thank you.